Well, may I express my thanks to both speakers for their presentations, which I think have given us a great deal to think about. If I can suggest that there are two themes, and really it's an interrelated theme and problem. It is the relationship between continuity in terms of what navies do and what navies need to do, and complexity in relation to the emerging problems, the changing world, and indeed the changing challenges. And I think it was Admiral Haney's point that, taken from the Secretary, that one always must adjust one's resources to match one's priorities. And I think the problem, and it isn't simply one of money, as the Admiral suggested, it is an intellectual problem, it is a problem of thought and a problem of fact, is deciding exactly where we need to move in adjusting our individual priorities. I now throw the floor open to questions. Could I remind the audience that we are seeking questions? I'd ask you to make them short. I'd prefer if you in fact directed them to either one or both speakers. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I welcome questions. Okay, we'll go back left and then middle.
Good morning, sirs. Lieutenant Commander Trevor Gibson. I'm an Operational Test Director with the RN's Test Evaluation and Acceptance Authority. My question is directed to both members, and it's to do with the ability of the USN to conduct power projection through their strategy of forward deployment. This allows them to influence, to provide presence, and also to undertake deterrence. My question relates to two recent events in the US, namely sequestration, in some cases called castration, and also the recent government shutdown. Does this influence the ability of the USN to provide power projection? And if it does, through their rebalance program, do you have the ability to measure how much it has been reduced?
I think that's it for you, Admiral.
Good question. I thank you for it. There's no doubt that we're working politically, sequestration and this government shutdown. Those of you paying attention to the news can see that we're getting through this. You know, although we're shut down, I'm here. And you can also read that our DOD and our governmental folks are in fact coming back to work. Like everything, it's a journey. But I can assure you, during this journey, we've maintained our credible capability of the United States Navy forward, not just in the Indo-Asia-Pacific region, but in other parts of the world. So we didn't stop the screws turning and the radars spinning, for those radars that do spin today, most of which don't. But we're out and about, just as we have been, quite frankly, as a naval force. So I thank you for that question, but we continue to move about militarily. Thank you.
Yeah, to add to what Admiral Haney said, and I think this is true of current political developments. It's also true of policy statements like the rebalance. The truth is, the United States has a long-term involvement in and a long-term interest in and deep engagement with the Asia-Pacific region. And you know, our shift in focus and shift in emphasis to the region predated, you know, the current administration's emphasis on the rebalance, which I actually think is a good thing. We began, it's really been going on, although in low profile, for probably about a dozen years or so. And so similarly, I think it's very easy to get wrapped up in the current headlines and lose sight of the fact that really it has been a long-term policy of the United States across administrations to place greater emphasis on the region. So whatever happens in the very short term, I think we're seeing the playing out of a longer term increase in focus and emphasis on the region.
Okay, in the middle.
Lieutenant Commander Josh Wilson, I'm with the DDG Capability Implementation Team. I'd like to direct my question to Professor Mencken there. Your points this morning on the role of persistence and the idea of deterrence and the way we need to move ahead, I thank you very much for those, but I would ask the question, are we looking at a very traditional role in the state-on-state actor as a traditional role for persistence and deterrence? And I'd be curious on your thoughts on how you see those roles developing in the future as we see the rise of the non-state actor and how the difficulties in identifying them to actually apply that deterrence and persistence role.
Yeah, no, it's a wonderful question, and I wish I could give you a very neat, definitive answer, but I can't. But what I can say is that, look, deterrence is situational and it's targeted. You seek to deter a particular actor, whether it's a state or a non-state actor, and your ability to deter that state or non-state actor depends very much upon the situation. And I just think it's a topic that hasn't gotten the amount of attention that it probably deserves. We assume a lot about the ability of just say naval forces to deter. And my plea is for a little bit more study so that we can figure out really what does deter particular actors in particular situations, and also what doesn't. So I certainly wouldn't limit my comments to states. I would say deterring states can be difficult enough, and non-state actors can be even more difficult.
One other if I can put a practical application to this, something that we Navies do together, and that is we're working hard at understanding the maritime domain and how to look at it, how to fuse together the information. I look at, for example, Singapore and their fusion center approach, for example, and there are other approaches depending on what part of the globe we look at. But the more and more we delve into that piece with that goal of holistically trying to neck down on the inability to prevent non-state actors from being able to use the sea commons as a means of transport and mischief is a collective goal I think everybody in the room would raise their hand on. And it's how do we get there? How do we make that aware that that's not the option of ease has been something we've been working on and must continue to do. And in some cases, I think it has been serving as a deterrent. In other cases, we got to continue to step up the game.
Good morning. Lee Corden, University of Adelaide. My question's addressed to both Professor Mencken and to Admiral Haney. We'll all recall, I'm sure, that Clausewitz and Corbett both wrote about the importance of understanding the nature of a conflict, and in contemporary risk management terms, that could be translated to understanding the risk context. So in this changing environment that you've both spoken about, I wonder how you see the risks and opportunities emerging, particularly in the area that one of the questioners has already raised, of the relationship between many players who are not only navies in this business of managing maritime security and dealing with maritime security risks and opportunities. Thank you.
Lee, it's an excellent question. I think the maritime security offers a great opportunity, for cooperation. But as you note, understanding the nature of the war or the nature of the problem, if you will, can be a big challenge. And I think when we do so, we have to differentiate between a number of different types of actors. So even within, say, non-state actors, I would differentiate between, say, those with political motivations, meaning whether you want to call them insurgents, guerrillas, terrorists, those who fundamentally are seeking to use the commons to political effect, and say pirates, who are economically motivated. Those are two very different sets of actors. So sort of the logic of strategy, I think, clearly applies to political actors. The kind of the logic of benefit and risk, I think, applies more clearly to pirates. Most pirates don't have a political agenda. Their agenda is profit. And if you can drive up the risk, sufficiently to them, well, they'll go seek money other ways, legal or illegal. But a political actor that's seeking, a political objective in competition with yours, there's a different sort of calculus there. So I would very much echo Clausewitz, in that the Supreme Act is to understand the nature of the war you're fighting, neither mistaking it for something that it isn't, or trying to turn it into something that's alien to its nature. I think oftentimes, just parsing out who we're talking about, the nature of those actors, what their motivations are, and what they seek, and then how we can affect them, that takes us a long way to developing a strategy to deal with them.
I would agree wholeheartedly, and I would say, although this is a maritime conference, as we look at getting the non-state actors and applying that, risks and opportunities as you described, the real key is removing seams and gaps from the maritime domain to the other domains by which these actors reside. We have to understand, frame the problem, and get at it in a holistic framework, and not just in segregated constructs, if you will. Thank you.
At the front.
Good morning. I'm Emerald Miller from Chilean Navy. To Professor Mencken, I want to ask, do you think is there any constraint for the small navies, as mine, to apply the same attributes you mentioned for the big navies?
That's an excellent question. I think one trade-off that all nations, all navies face is the trade-off between providing sovereign capability and working as part of a greater coalition or alliance. And sovereign capability tends to drive you, any navy, small or large, to try to do everything. Whereas burden sharing, working across alliances and coalitions, allows you some more flexible choices. And so I think one of the decisions, and I'll say that all navies face. Perhaps it's more acute for small navies, but I think all navies face is what capabilities can they rely upon others to provide, or rely upon other armed forces or institutions to provide, and what do they absolutely need to keep for themselves. So I think actually the choices are universal. I think the challenge that small navies face is just fewer resources in the basket, and so the choices are maybe sharper. But I think everybody faces those choices.
Good morning. Captain Tony Aldred, Director Current Operations, Headquarters Joint Operations Command. My question is to Admiral Haney, but I'd invite comments from you too soon. Given India is a non-aligned country, but it's strategically positioned in regards to global maritime security in both the Indian Ocean and the Malacca Strait contexts, how do you see the US relationship with India developing in the near to medium term? Who will lead, given the juncture between PACOM and CENTCOM across the continent of India? And what role do you think Australia should play in further developing those relationships, given that we are already involved in IONS and other similar fora?
Good question. Clearly, you know, from the United States of America, but more appropriately in my role from the United States Navy, we continue to work with the Indian Navy. I think, quite frankly, a fairly decent relationship as we work our Malabar exercise series, various port visits and what have you. I had the unique pleasure of traveling to India near the beginning of this year, and it was great to finally get there and talk to the leadership there. As with any country, every country has its values and its sovereignty, as we've described here, and just as the United States of America, and very important that we work to understand each other and work where there are common interests, that we continue to work that area with due diligence. And I think that's important. When you ask the question of Australia's role, when I look at this Indo-Asian Pacific region, I look at it as not something that I do alone when it comes to naval business. It's one that I clearly count on the work of other nations. The business, as I travel about, one of my questions is how do other nations, other Navy leaders, and their governments look at the world through their lens, not through my lens, so I can understand it better. That's why this intellectual rebalance to me is so darn important, that we do that, and we do that with a patient approach to clearly work to understand the values of each country, because each country has its own uniqueness and interests and vital interests associated with solution solving. So when you say who will lead, right now I know whose area of operation and responsibility that is. My boss at Pacific Command, Admiral Sam Locklear. And I won't speculate in terms of a future associated with some of the articles you may have been reading, et cetera. That's where we are today. And more to follow perhaps in the future. But as we look at how the U.S. has split up the world in terms of geographical combatant commands, we don't work in isolation. Quite frankly, if there's anything that I've seen during my tenure as a naval officer, as a joint officer, is just how we have worked hard and do due diligence every day to reduce those seams so we aren't working in isolation. Thank you for your question.
Tom.
And I would agree with what Admiral Haney has said. You know, look, the Indian Navy is a highly capable Navy, and India is a great power. I think one of the good things about being a Navy and maritime relations is sometimes it is easier to cooperate in the maritime realm than in other spheres. And I think certainly with my limited experience between U.S. Indian cooperation in the naval realm, I think that's very much the case. I think as to the scope and pace of that cooperation, that's really driven by governments, and governments respond to their electorates and all sorts of things. I do think that over the long term, if you think about coincidence of interests, and you also think about shared values, I think there's a lot that India and the United States have in common, and so. Quite apart from any particular sort of timetable, I think I'm very bullish on Indo-American relations. I think Australia has a very important role to play, and it's already, I think, is playing that role. Just given Australia's geography and Australia's constellation of relationships, Australia's position, it's part of the Commonwealth. I think it can play a very important role. And finally, I can't hesitate because Admiral Haney raised the the point of the unified command plan and the way that our geographic commands are set up. As a veteran of a number of those go-arounds, there's no perfect way to do it. There's just various shades of compromise. You redraw the lines or take lines away. There's no perfect solution. So we should never fool ourselves that there is an optimal out there.
Given the nature of that question and the presence of an Indian Navy representative, I was wondering if Admiral Chopra would care to comment. Would you care to comment on the question yourself, sir? Please.
Well, thank you for your comments in the first place about the Indian Navy and its role over here. I think I would tend to agree with both the speakers that the relationships of India and its Navy with the Indo-Pacific is only increasing, and that it is possibly stronger on the maritime to maritime front, and we'll take it from there. That's about what I could say now. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Any more? Yep, Linda, the microphone's on its way. Yep.
Good morning, Linda Jacobson from the Lowy Institute for International Policy. I'd like to address my question mainly, I would say, to Admiral Haney. Have you been involved with the recent search and rescue exercises with the Chinese PLA Navy? And looking forward and thinking of Rimpac next year, how do you see cooperation between the US and China in the maritime sphere? Thank you.
Well, Linda, thank you for that question. It's very interesting that here at the International Fleet Review, the PLAN ship Chengdao also participated. That ship and two other ships that were with it very recently visited Hawaii. I was there. Actually, I was there on the pier when they came in to greet them. We truly value our opportunities to do mill-to-mill with them, and in fact, at the conclusion of that port visit, we did conduct a bilateral search and rescue exercise with those ships. And to me, coming on the heels of numerous exchanges in terms of strategic talks between my leadership, Chinese leadership, including president to president. I followed, I was on the heels of Chairman Dempsey's visit to China, where I went to China, visited both Beijing and then the South Sea Fleet headquarters. Able to see Chief of Navy Admiral Wu, and was really happy to see him follow up that visit with a visit to the United States, where he went through San Diego, one of our major Pacific Fleet hubs, and also he went to the DC with the CNO and continued with that exchange on the East Coast. Quite frankly, it is so important, in my opinion, that navies work together, and that as we have, in some cases, differences, that we work on those areas that we do commonly need to value and work as a team. So clearly our Navy-to-Navy, military-to-military work and relationships has a long ways to go, just getting started, because there was a gap in terms of what we were doing. So when previous Secretary of Defense invited the Chinese Navy to participate in Rim of the Pacific, we went to work. We've participated in one initial planning conference. It's been talked about, and frankly, every visit that they've come to the United States, or we go over there. So it's clearly a high interest, and quite frankly, Rimpac is a great forum because it's a multilateral event. And there we will do things that all navies value and participate in: humanitarian assistance, search and rescue, as you've mentioned, and some other areas. So I'm quite frankly very excited about this possibility of bringing China to Rimpac. We had Russia for the first time in Rimpac last year, and it is an area where, although we have senior leaders of the navies that are participating in the work that's done there, it to me is the interaction of the sailors that also is a key contributor to our future. And just watching that magic, Rimpac after Rimpac, quite frankly, and even when I was in China, we had the cruiser Shiloh that was part of that ship's visit. Seeing our sailors interact with Chinese Navy sailors was also a good thing to have. What we don't want is to go through long periods where we're not talking to a group there, because we're all on the Maritime Commons together. So we have to be able to communicate with each other so that there aren't any miscalculations based on miscommunications. So this whole business of port visits, high-level visits, and of course, Rim of the Pacific. My only regret in Rim of the Pacific is I won't be commanding the Pacific Fleet when that comes around, but very excited about the participation, not just of China, but of all the nations that come. Thank you.
David.
David Letts, Centre for Military and Security Law, Australian National University. Question for both speakers. The intellectual rebalance that Admiral Haney was talking about, do you see as part of that scope for a realignment of America's position in relation to the Law of the Sea Convention, and some final progress going to happen in that area, perhaps?
Sure, I'll start off on that. Look, I think I would start with the U.S. Constitution, which gives the Senate the power to ratify treaties. And it is a fact that multiple administrations, since the Law of the Sea Treaty was concluded, have sought ratification. But up until now, the Senate, with different political parties in majority over time, they've failed to secure the number of votes to ratify the treaty. That having been said, the United States acts in accordance with the Law of the Sea Treaty and has done so for years and years. Other countries have ratified the treaty and haven't acted in accordance with the treaty. So look, what you have is what would, from as an observer, what would really need to happen for the treaty to be ratified. It would be for a president to expend, I think, significant political capital to try to do that. But as I say, even though it's unratified, if you look at the U.S. behavior, U.S. behaves routinely and has for years and for decades at this point, in accordance with the Law of the Sea Treaty. So
that was so astutely answered that I don't think I need to say anymore. Thank you.
Nav.
Admiral Sir, Professor Markin, my name is Midshipman Nam Ewan, Australian Defence Force Academy. I'd like to build on the last two questions from Linda and David Letts with regards to also the cooperation and in a domestic sense. Now, the crisis group suggested that perhaps a lot of tensions and miscalculations is not necessarily between navies and mil-mil relations, and that a lot of domestic actors and domestic law enforcement agencies are inciting tensions, and that's where the miscalculations can occur. Can you provide your comments on the need to break through that in terms of cooperating also with domestic law enforcement agencies to ensure that miscalculations do not occur?
All right, I'll start on this one, if I've got your question right. This gets into, for me, why it's so important. That is, a military, you can't be disconnected from your governmental organizations either, and you have to work to minimize those seams, there's one thing I would say in particular our counterterrorism efforts have done, in particular since 9/11, has glued together for us in the U.S. A lot of glue between our various organizations in the government. And that piece has been important, and that's why when I talk rebalance, I always talk about a whole-of-government approach, not just the Navy, not just the military, but that whole of government, very important in terms of that business. And as you astutely, I think, tried to pull out here, or did, and that is when you look at military law enforcement agencies and what they do in the region here, very important that we understand their rules of the road, you know, who they're working for, et cetera, and make sure as we find maritime solutions to the problem that we look at it holistically and not just looking at it as an approach in one area. And I would also say that it's not just maritime law enforcement agencies, it's the business of being able to look at all domains, whether that's space, cyber, et cetera, in terms of activities. And then where do we as Navies, where is our most effective role in participating to work to deter ashore, et cetera?
And I think certainly agree with Admiral Haney. And you know, from a U.S. perspective, I think you know one of the very powerful levers that we have that's I think oftentimes underappreciated is the U.S. Coast Guard. Both you know the Coast Guard itself and its maritime law enforcement role, but also the Coast Guard attachés that serve in embassies across the world, including in Asia. I think, in my experience, those Coast Guard officers have played a very important role in speaking directly to other maritime safety and maritime law enforcement organizations across the region, and I think they really do play an important role.
Yeah, it is interesting. I do have a Coast Guard officer that's on my staff that allows us to facilitate even better communications and that, to share.
Okay, before we go to the right, I'm going to in fact take a Twitter question from Alistair Cooper, which is for Tom, as you can see, to expand on future flexibility of navies and precision strike in the context of developments in cyber and unmanned vehicles.
Yeah. I think unmanned systems, really with unmanned aerial vehicles kind of leading the way, do offer some substantial opportunities to maintain and increase the flexibility of navies. Particularly application of UAVs for maritime domain awareness. I think, and this actually ties back to the previous question, I think you know, a key element of disputed actions in Asian waters has to do with just ground truth. Who did what happened? And so I think the ability of manned platforms, but particularly unmanned platforms to cover broad ocean areas, do broad ocean area surveillance, offers an opportunity to really multiply the ability of naval forces to project presence and to deter and to reassure. So I think that's actually an important one. I think unmanned undersea vehicles. Similarly, although I think that the nature of the domain, the nature of the technology is not as mature there and less accessible.
Admiral, do you want to comment on that one?
Well, I agree clearly with Professor Mencken. This whole business of unmanned gives us persistence in a different way, and then using it to improve our intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance capability important. And obviously, we're in the United States use it to integrate with our other ISR kind of capabilities, give us a broader picture. I think the question also dealt with strike in that business of UAVs and being able to use them for precision strike and what have you. And I think the history book has already been written in terms of that, as I consider that part of the package of precision strike kinds of capabilities.
Thank you. James Dedarian from the Center for National Security Studies, University of Sydney. Tip O'Neill, the congressman, said that all politics is local. We're getting a lesson in that right now in the United States in what's going on in our US Congress. And I'm just curious how much the Asian pivot and even the operational capability of the US Navy is being affected by a shutdown, a federal shutdown, and how that might play out in the future. If a very small minority in the United States Congress can effectively affect not only economics of military preparedness, but also the doctrine, in the sense that there is a new isolationism amongst a minority, a very vocal and very effective minority. How do you see that down the line influencing U.S. strategy in the Pacific? And I understand, as a military flag officer, a reluctance to get into politics, but your boss, Secretary of Defense Hagel, has been very vocal about this. So I'm just curious as to how it might, in the future, cause a realignment or a reassessment of capacity and ambitions in the Pacific.
Well, I think my boss answered that question recently here when I asked, when he asked, was it affecting our operations? He said no, and very pointedly answered that question. So I agree with him. But I will say, as a Pacific Fleet commander, I mean, I have about a third of my fleet out and about doing things today. And not just in this region, as I talked about earlier when I was up there for the presentation and the first question that was asked in the back. We will continue to work the rebalance. I showed a slide up here, and maybe it was missed. It showed the cyclic behavior of our budgetary business, because it's money that is a major portion of the resources. Time is also a resource, and people, obviously. But that money buys people and talent associated. With those peaks and valleys, we haven't left. Even when we were very, very busy in another AOR, not only did we not leave, we were on a steady improvement of capability out here. My answer remains the same. We are committed to this rebalance. And quite frankly, I won't speculate with you over how the Congress of the United States will come out with an answer here between now and X number of days. I will just say historically we have worked our democracy, and that I'm very proud of, and come up with a solution, and then we moved ahead. So that's the way I see this rebalance will stay on a course, and the business of democracy will continue to churn, and we will have a solution, and we will continue to move forward. Thank you.
I guess my 2 cents is, look, that I think there is a very broad consensus in Congress in favor of a strong U.S. international role. And I would note that despite the failure of the executive and the legislature to agree on a budget, Congress very early on gave the Secretary of Defense the authority to keep not only the military on duty, but put DOD civilians back to work. And DOD civilians, as Admiral Haney said, are back to work. So I would say, regardless of the domestic politics having to do with spending priorities and the size of the budget, I think there is a broad internationalist consensus within Congress. You're right. There are isolationists on the very left wing and the very right wing of the political spectrum, as there is a body of thought in Australia that sort of aims for sort of armed neutrality as opposed to the Australia-U.S. alliance. But I would also say that the last electoral cycle that the United States went through after the 2008 financial crisis should have been the perfect opportunity for isolationism to arise in the United States. And it didn't. So again, something might change in the future, but you know, I've lived long enough to hear, you know, sort of with every decade, every generation, concerns about American isolationism. Look, the truth is the United States really wasn't that isolationist in the 1920s or 30s, at least as far as Asia was concerned. Again, maybe something will change in the future, but I wouldn't bet on it.
Thank you.
Good morning. David Palmer, concerned civilian. I'm here to get a better understanding of how we use our navies to keep us secure. But my question based to both the professor and the admiral is, if I'm correct in my readings, within the next 3 years, China will put to sea its first carrier. Not long after that, possibly its second. Now this running around and being the bonhomie and all this sort of thing amongst navies is all very well, but it's not totally reassuring to us civilians. Navies are here to protect us and to fight. So my question is, why do the Chinese see a necessity for aircraft carriers? What do they intend to do with them? And finally, what impact will this have on strategy? Thank you.
Well, one, Mr. Palmer, I thank you for your interest in the maritime domain and your thoughtful question. One piece I do want to say is, as far as I'm concerned, China has already put a carrier to sea. And putting it in a bigger frame, as you look at China's economy, as you look at China's dependency on what we talked about here a bit over just how much trade flows through the maritime domain, I think China is also interested in maritime security and the secure transport of its commodities and goods to and fro. When so much of our trade goes by sea, that's a common interest amongst all nations. So as Chinese economy improved, not surprising to me that China would increase their maritime capability across the board. It's not a surprise, quite frankly, given their interests globally of where all the resources and what have you come from today, where they will come from in the future. And that's why I think it's very important that we continue to work on a mill-to-mill, Navy-to-Navy, Navies to Navies with China so that we can continue to work to make sure we can communicate with each other where it matters in that regard. Probably as we look at any country with growing military capability, the real key is how transparent is that, how transparent is not just what they're building and how they use it, but what's their overall intent. And that's the piece that I think time will tell as we go forward.
As to why China wants aircraft carriers, I think there's a mixture of motivations. One of the big ones being status. So that one of the major coins of the naval realm, for the last number of decades is having an aircraft carrier. And so I think a good part of the Chinese carrier program is status, and it's certainly the Liaoning and the carrier program more generally has become an object of a lot of national pride. Now, it's also a military unit, and I think for military purposes, they're interested in a carrier for regional presence, regional power projection. It's tremendously expensive to build aircraft carriers and maintain aircraft carriers and to develop the skills to operate them, including the air wing. In terms of the capabilities that China's been acquiring, I think it's not at the top of my list of things that keeps me up at night, quite honestly. But yeah, I think it's a mixture of prestige, motivation, and the capabilities that type of a carrier brings to bear.
Eric.
Thanks. Eric Grove, Liverpool Hope University. Once upon a time, there was another great global power called the British Empire, and it did have its forward deployed capital ship assets, actually. There were capital ships on the China Station, there were capital ships in the Mediterranean. they could be backed up as required. If trouble arose with a particularly troublesome nation, which was usually Russia in the second half of the 20th century, then we formed a particular service squadron, and the Russians were silly enough to have their capital on the coast. And so we threatened to repeat what we'd done at Acre in 1840 against St. Petersburg, and indeed we threatened at the end of the Russian War. Now, eventually, that country began an inexorable process of, well, I can't think of a better word, decline, although that can be overstated in lots of ways, but nonetheless, it happened. Round about 100 years ago, the British Empire was beginning its pivot to Europe because of the rise of German naval power, major sort of reassessment of Britain's strategic priorities. And of course, we are celebrating here one result of that, which was the creation of the fleet units to try to look after what was, in fact, at that time a subsidiary theatre, the Pacific. But there was the plan, as we know, to create fleet units and get other Commonwealth countries like New Zealand, for example, to subsidize a battle cruiser and build up a fleet in Hong Kong. The point I think I'm trying to make is that are we seeing, in the very longest of terms, we've seen the rise of India, the rise even more of China, are we beginning to see, and perhaps, a relative decline in American power, which the Americans are going to have to cope with in the 21st century. The second half of the 20th century was no doubt America's century, beginning of the 21st. Now we seem to be moving into a situation where there are growing rivals, where those rivalries are going to have to be managed in various ways by direct relationships between the rivals and by realignments of states into various forms of alliances and ententes. And in these circumstances, is the United States not going to have to, as we had to with our Commonwealth partners in the early 20th century, come into even greater relationships and greater dependencies on allied countries, friendly countries, and build up a set of relationships, in a sense, echoing the last question, which is, we are going to have to try to separate this general let's be nice to everybody into a more general kind of alignment of which countries are on our side, potentially, in certain circumstances that might, we hope not, arise.
So, I deliberately didn't talk about American decline in my paper because the trends that I outlined, I think, are underway regardless. Now, I don't want to sidetrack this into a whole discussion of decline, but I mean, in one way, look, the United States has been in economic decline since 1945. Meaning that at the end of World War II, most of the other major industrial economies were in shambles, and ours wasn't. And really, as the success of post-war reconstruction and the success of the rising economies in Asia and elsewhere means that as a percentage of global output, the U.S. economy has declined. But if that's decline, I'm fine with it. If you're talking about decline as pundits tend to do, honestly, I think that those discussions tend to arise, and they arise periodically in American history, driven by sort of recent events, and at least again heretofore, I think the pundits have been wrong. I remember the declinist debate in the 1980s. Driven by Paul Kennedy and others, when the Japanese economy was going to conquer all, and it didn't seem to work out that way. Now again, this time could be different, but actually, as I look out on trends, whether they're in fossil fuels, natural resources, when it's trends in manufacturing, including additive manufacturing, trends in IT. I'm actually quite bullish on the United States and the U.S. economy. So who knows? But my view of naval cooperation is not driven by need so much as it is the mutual benefit to the United States and to others. I personally have 3 criteria for thinking about collaboration. Does it make sense for the United States? Does it make sense for our ally or our partner? And together, can we do things that disproportionately benefit us by acting together? Seems to me that if you can answer those three questions in the affirmative, then there's a case for cooperation. If you can't, it doesn't make sense. So, but the types of things that I'm thinking about meet those criteria. So it's not driven by necessity, but I actually think by the promise of collaboration. That's driven by the nature of information technology, ISR, things like that really promise to give disproportionate gains to those who collaborate and buy in. So,
thanks. Captain Manzi.
Hello, Captain Paul Manzi, Australia's Defence Attaché to Southern Europe. My question is both to Admiral Haney and to Professor Mencken. Do you see the development of area denial weapons and the potential weaponization of space diminishing the strategic significance of naval power as we know it today?
When you look at anti-access kinds of capabilities, and I go back in history and look at, in some cases, the number of ships sunk in World War II from a variety of different anti-access weapons, it's not some new theme, quite frankly, that maritime capability has had to deal with. I think we learned significantly during the attack on Pearl Harbor back on December 7th, 41. And the business of capability as it's developed, et cetera, clearly it's one that has to be appreciated as changes in anti-access capability, access denial capability improve. Then similarly, naval forces have to improve, but not just naval forces alone. The collective capability of our joint forces have to be able to get at the problem. So I fundamentally feel there's clearly still a role in the maritime capability in this world we live in today and well into the future.
I agree with the Admiral, and just to maybe elaborate a little bit. Look, I think the importance of sea power and the importance of navies is fundamentally driven by the huge level of economic interaction across the seas, and so the real value of navies is driven by politics. It's driven by economics. The spread of precision strike capabilities, including the development of anti-access capabilities, is making that a more challenging environment in which navies will operate. But it doesn't diminish the value of sea power and the value of navies. It just makes it a more challenging environment that we have to deal with. And as Admiral Haney said, we've dealt with challenging environments in the past. In retrospect, the past couple decades have been remarkably risk-free when it comes to the maritime domain. Again, in a historical perspective, we're just moving back to a more contested commons.
Okay, middle right and then the back.
Thanks, gentlemen. This is Lieutenant Colonel Nick Floyd from the Australian Defence College. My question is to both the Admiral and to Tom. Both of you gentlemen have provided a lot of commentary about the global commons and where we're going with collective security, and indeed the confluence of sovereignty enforcement as well as law enforcement, which are all very apposite, and we've seen that those things are going to go forward. Can I draw both of you gentlemen on two particular aspects of how that's going to be applied into the future, and that's both the appeal and the increasing accessibility of both the North Pole and the South Pole, particularly as Antarctica's treaty is coming up for review in the near future. How would you see both the US treating those two issues, and perhaps some insight into where you think, as a collective global security conglomerate, we should all be treating both those two issues?
I think it's going to take some time for international shipping to accommodate the availability of of routes near the North Pole. And just one point I would make is, quite apart from that development, you also have the widening of the Panama Canal, and you have the expansion of en route infrastructure along the major shipping routes, the major existing shipping routes. And so I think a lot is said about the benefits of travel kind of along the North Pole, but the en route infrastructure and the port infrastructure on either way just doesn't currently exist, let alone the maritime safety infrastructure doesn't fully exist to be able to exploit those routes. So I guess I tend to see that as a future potential rather than a near-term issue. Again, what I see on the international shipping market, it really is much more driven by expansion of the Panama Canal and further exploitation of existing infrastructure rather than building the new infrastructure that would be required for some of these other routes.
A good question. I think when you look geographically, just the distances that being able to use like an Arctic route becomes very appealing. And as more potential exists, that will, in my opinion, be utilized more. As maritime force capability, the piece that I'm concerned, are we looking hard at what capabilities will we need for that future? Because when we get the calls of needing help in search and rescue, needing icebreakers, things of that nature, it will be a collective kind of response there as well, because it'll become more and more utilized. But as was mentioned here, that time frame by which that accelerates is a good question right now. But it is an area that bears looking at now. It bears talking about in various diplomatic and what have you forums to make sure there is some understanding of the nature of that environment and the rules of the road and international norms associated with it that are in fact very important. Having had various submarines that have transited through the Arctic over time, deep understanding of the harshness and non-risk-free of that environment. So it's not a trivial matter whatsoever, but it does bear some intellect, I think, today as we look at the future.
Up back.
I'm Aidan Morrison from Rubberducky Defence, a small Australian defence tech company. I had a question for Professor Hankin, but I'd like to invite comment from Admiral Haney about force structure. Professor Hankin, your third and fourth suggestion said we should have forces which should be more survivable when they're deployed forward and also be able to strike from further away. Mm-hmm. It seems to me that would exacerbate the other trend that you identified, that navies are becoming much more expensive, mm-hmm. Which is going to cause issues for presence and being able to have ships in different places at different times. Is that divergent requirement, is there any emergent solution to that? And if it is differentiated forces, could you flesh out a little further where we might differentiate our forces for peacetime presence in our current force structure, or what future force developments might be required to bridge that gap in requirement?
Mm-hmm. So let me actually pose a couple of alternatives that are kind of that bracket the ends of the spectrum, and I really think that the reality lies in the middle, which is why I talked about differentiating forces. So, one alternative in a contested environment is to pull back and think about operating from a distance. What you're doing there is reducing the risk to your forces. You're reducing your operational risk or your tactical risk to your forces. But if you do too much of that, you're actually driving up strategic risk, which is you're driving up risk to your relationships, to your alliances. You risk becoming a sort of a garrison force and undermining presence, undermining international norms and so forth. The other, the other ideal type is staying forward deployed and accepting greater risk to your forces, but that can you can lose credibility if you do that too much as well. I mean, the U.S. the story of the U.S. Asiatic squadron, kind of on the eve of World War II, where you have forward deployed forces that really aren't survivable, is problematic. So what I think is you need to do both. So you need to harden and diversify forward-based forces, and then you also have to have the ability to reinforce them. And so I think that means, to the extent possible, building in redundancy, having probably more but perhaps less capable forces forward initially, but then having kind of more capable forces in backup. So that's, I mean, it's a way of coping with the operational environment, also coping with the some of the economic budgetary challenges and the cost drivers as well.
Good question. The overall approach, when you look at force structure, has to be in balance with, ends, ways, and means. And very important as you look at the various, not just strategies, but operational plans to deal with conflict. And that in itself would probably be a 2-week discussion, which I'll try to condense a little bit here. As you look at this, at least from the United States of America's approach, and as we look at providing our national security apparatus a range of military options, we have evolved into a joint construct. And so it's integration of maritime capabilities along with other things. And then taking this balanced approach so that we can, in fact, balance things holistically, looking at risk. So, in my opinion, you've got to have an assortment of platforms to do different things. It can't just all be super high-end. Those are applicable where required. But then at the other side of the coin, you have to have other platforms that are able to be built in increased numbers and what have you. As I look at the future of maritime capability, in that same vein, as we look at going through, in our case, a very rigorous requirements process before we can go buy something, it's how do we infuse as much future payload capability that can be rolled in and rolled out for as the technology changes and allows us to have even different approaches in the maritime domain than perhaps we're accustomed to and where we are today. I feel that's immensely important as we look at both the cost curve as well as the capability curve. And then, as I say, this business of fusing the maritime capability with other capabilities in order to win.
Last question.
Lieutenant Commander John Bird, Navy League of Australia. Just following on from the Twitter question, Professor Mencken, you made frequent references to service forces in your address. Would you care to comment on the role, the very special role of the submarine in deterrence, power projection, assurance, and so on? Thank you.
I should actually ask Admiral Haney as the submariner, but I'll take the first crack. I think that the role of the submarine actually helps illustrate some of the trends that I talked about. If one thinks just about combat effectiveness, strike capability, undersea forces and submarines, U.S. submarines in particular, I think are premier strike assets. They are they possess some of the greatest combat capability in the U.S. Navy. And yet, I'd say their value is only going to increase over time as the maritime domain becomes increasingly contested. And yet, we haven't very consciously thought about using submarines as instruments of presence or reassurance. Certainly have thought about submarines as a deterrent. So you have a naval combatant whose one of his most precious assets is its stealthiness. And how you think about that also as an instrument of presence, again, we tend to equate presence with visibility. How to think about presence and reassurance from a stealthy platform, I think is a really interesting question. And I put it that as a question because I actually think that there probably are ways, very creative ways to think about these things. I just don't think people have devoted enough attention to it. But here you have a platform with enormous combat capability. How to think about it as part of the flexible application of naval power, I think is really an interesting question.
Thank you for a submarine question. That's good, too. In our country, submarines have been part of the deterrence equation for a good portion of my career, particularly in the nuclear deterrence equation, having served on at least one of those platforms. When we look at deterrence, that piece is always in the potential enemy's eyes of how they see what we're doing or not. I sometimes feel the most deterrent piece of a submarine is not being seen when we show the glossy of the carrier strike group and everything else. I frequently get asked, well, where's the submarine? And I just say it's there. I mean, where is it there is very, is the paradoxical piece that you want, quite frankly, some ambiguity. And I was recently, well, not recently, I guess now it was about 7 years ago. I was traveling through Africa, stopped in South Africa, and they had recently got a 209 submarine from Europe, and they let us climb all through it and what have you. And I was interested in the more strategic question of, well, this is a tremendous investment in terms of industry, manpower, training, and what have you, to have two. How do you feel you're going to use it strategically and what have you? And they basically gave me a similar answer. It's once we submerge it, it's strategic. And consequently, though, it's how do you tie all that together so that it's understood in your strategic approach to the business. I'm not, even though a submariner, I lead the Pacific Fleet, and I'm proud of all the different capabilities I have to bring to bear on a problem. And to me, the submarine aspect is one of those areas that's darn important, and we work hard to keep that capability in our Navy. What bothers me in terms of trends a bit is sort of that picture I saw there is in South Africa since then is how many nations want more and more and more to have submarines. And then for what purpose? Just like we were talking about the Arctic, the undersea domain is a dangerous domain too. But I will say I'm very proud of how we have glued that together in submarine rescue, and that there's an international response effort in that regard. But with regards to presence, we pull them in port periodically so that they can be seen and what have you, but it will never give you that picture as if you went aboard Perth or you went aboard Darwin, or any of our combatants that are out here on the Australian waterfront. The submarine looks small and shanty on the waterfront. Real key is what capability it delivers and the understanding of that capability. So it's integral, and to me it is part of the deterrence equation. that's used, and periodically allowing it to pull and port to be seen is very important. Thank you.
Thank you, Admiral. Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our session. May I make one administrative request that if you're attending the next session, you be back in here at 10:55 for our 11 o'clock start. But before we leave, may I ask you to join me in thanking our speakers not only for their presentations but for their willingness to be grilled for what was well over an hour in what I think was a thought-provoking and extremely useful session. So if you could express your thanks to both of our speakers in the usual way. Thank you.